So one of the things that we want to hopefully introduce to you, or perhaps you've encountered sometime in the past, is talking about what would be my mission field. In other words, who are people that I encounter that either I know they don't believe in Jesus, or I just don't know because I've never gone far enough in the conversation to figure that out. And so we really want to begin perhaps a practice for you, which is one that I've had for about 40 years now, is praying by name or by the description of those who either don't know Jesus or you don't know because you haven't gotten far enough into the conversation. So just to give you an idea, we were looking for something at Home Depot, one of those kind of things that all of us end up doing if you're a homeowner. And I was looking for something very specific and very odd, and I really wasn't sure they'd have it. So that meant I needed to talk to the person on the floor. And he was amazingly helpful. He was quite chatty. He was happy to walk us all around the store trying to find it. And of course, ultimately, failure. Don't come up with it. But the good thing about it was, as we began to talk, he finally said, "So why do you need a well filter wrench?" Because that's a little unusual. And I explained that we had a house in North Carolina and that this particular thing need to change the filters on. And he said, so where have you been living and why are you here? And that ultimately came down to the aspect of saying, well, I've lived in Europe for 35 years. And his response was, well, what did you do? Now, here's an awkward moment because I'm a missionary. So it's not always the easiest thing to share that with somebody, even in Middle Tennessee. And so my response was, I get to tell people about Jesus. Just kind of came out of my mouth. I wasn't really prepared for that. That wasn't my stock answer. But the response from him was, well, that's great because they need to hear about Jesus. And I was kind of backfooted. I didn't really know how to deal with that because I haven't really had a conversation with him. And so I pursued that in that way of leaning into it and saying, well, actually, I believe I need Jesus because of the sins in my life. And then I need to confess that. I think we're living in a broken world, which then led farther on to deeper conversations. Sometimes it is that even in a very first conversation, there is this idea and possibility of kind of figuring out where is the other person coming from spiritually. Many years ago, there was a Billy Graham crusade here in Nashville, and I was a college student and they needed counselors. And so I always thought, I guess Billy Graham's a big name and that's why everybody comes to the stadium. But what I've learned in the process of becoming a counselor was, he had a thing called Operation Andrew. He wrote down 5 names. This is months in advance, began to pray for them and opportunities to actually invite them to something and pray for conversations. And it was a discipline that I really began to take for myself, that I would write down names, pray for those names. And we're going to do an activity that looks very similar to that. You'll find on your table and also up on the screen, you'll find it says My Mission Field. And there are 5 different categories just to get you thinking about people that you may have encountered. So that could be your work colleagues. It could be people in your neighborhood. It could be social or family. The middle one maybe is a little puzzling. It says church. The church plant that we were a part of, 10 to 15% of the people who attended were not believers in Jesus yet. And so there is this aspect of if you've been going to church a long time and you just presume that everybody sitting next to you is a believer without having a conversation and really sharing your story and hearing their story, it's really difficult sometimes to do that. But that's why church is on there, because sometimes well, I don't know that I have to pray for, all the Christians or the pastor, but that's a different category of praying that we're encouraging you to do. So what I want you to do is take a couple of minutes, write down names, or some of you say, I'm not very good at names, and so you would say, write a description. This is the person who always checks me out at Publix. Very nice, but I really don't know where they stand with the Lord. And so write their names down, and then what we're going to do in just a minute is we're going to pair up and literally, can't give all the backstory, we don't have enough time for that, share the name of the person and one sentence where you met them, and then the other person's going to lift them up by name. Because no matter how many people we have here, that many people will be lifted up who either they don't know Jesus or we don't know if they know Jesus, and their name would be brought before the throne of God. So take a minute personally for a few minutes, write down some names on this list, and then in just a second, I'll ask you to get up, pair up again, except for this is speed dating. You can't go with the same partner. You got to move around, pick another person. You may have to actually get up. Don't even bother to sit down. It's a very brief. Here's the name. Here's, in my case, the guy who I met at Home Depot, and then my partner is going to pray for that person. Take a moment. I hope that that was really an amazing time for you, just in lifting up that name. So what do you do with that list? Well, I encourage you to, if you're a journaler, put those names down, different ones for each day of the week as you work through. Or perhaps write it on a piece of paper and tape it up on the mirror in your bathroom. I've actually sometimes taken a picture of it and used it as a screensaver for my phone so that I could remember those names. A little awkward when I was sitting with a guy whose name was on the list and the phone flashed up. However, I had been telling him that I have been praying for him, and so it made perfect sense for me to explain, this is my list of names that I think of and pray for, and so that would be how that would work in that situation. But I encourage you not to just see this as a one-time exercise, but it's a dynamic list that you'll add names to, or maybe you'll find out more about the people, and you'll come back later and you can take them off that list and just pray for them as followers of Christ and as they are being discipled. So I thought I was an extrovert. Well, I thought I was an extrovert until I married Laura, let me say that, and I found out she was actually a natural extrovert. I was an occupational extrovert, kind of came with the territory of being the youth minister at Brentwood, and you had to always be up front and be silly and fun and all the things that came with that. And so I've discovered the longer that I've gone through life, I'm actually probably more introverted than I ever imagined that I was. So about a month back, we get invited to a big party. Lots of people that are going to be there that I don't know. And I'm tired. By about 4:30, when we're supposed to be getting ready, Laura's starting to get ready, and I'm like, wow, I could just sit here. And so Laura, being the wonderful, loving wife, she said, all right, you can just sit there. Well, then all the condemnation are running through my mind. Well, I can't just sit here because she's going to go to the party no matter what. So get up, go to the party. Someone kind of introduced us to some other people, and I sat next to a 20-something year old guy who looked like he didn't want to be at the party either. Both of us didn't seem to fit in the normal mold of who the people were at the party. Well, that led to some discussions, which brought me to the point where I realized, okay, I need to start, asking a few questions, etc. He was a little curious because we played a game of name something memorable, and my memorable thing is I've got 3 passports, and so he thought that was kind of interesting. Then his response was, so were you kind of connected church and were you a missionary? I was like, great, been outed. Okay, just like the guy at Home Depot, now I've been outed again. And so I said, well, yes, we were. And he had an interesting question. It was, well, from what I understand about Europe, that probably is a hard discussion because they don't seem to, have a deep faith anymore. And we had a great discussion about that. The more that we talked, the more I realized that he had some background from church. He'd gone to a high school ministry, and yet he said, I'm an electrical engineer, and when it comes to that faith thing, I just can't make that jump. At this point, I said, there was a time in my life when I was really questioning, really scrutinizing all the things that I had been taught growing up in church, and really just, to be honest, was probably obnoxious to the people and the leaders around me because I just didn't get it. But then I went away to the mountains for a week with a bunch of guys, and the leader that I had I kept asking him all my really tricky theological questions. And his response was, I don't really know the answer to that, but I know that Jesus knows the answer to that, and if you believe that he is the truth, that truth will set you free. Well, after about 20 questions with the same answer, I realized this man had a peace and a confidence about future things and questions that I had no idea about. And I went away by myself away from everybody, and just sat down and said, God, if you're there, reveal yourself to me. And Jesus did reveal himself to me in a way that all of a sudden those questions became so much less important. And my attitudes changed and my actions changed. And when I got home from that week, one of my friend's mothers, after about 30 minutes of watching me, came up and said, what happened to you? Because it was so obvious something had happened. It didn't mean that I was perfect. I still struggled and questioned and maybe said inappropriate things. But all of a sudden, I actually had a peace and a confidence for what it was like. Now, what I have just done in that conversation with that young man and what I've just modeled for you is something that we call my life before, what happened, and my life afterwards. And we actually have a model in Scripture that deals with that. The Apostle Paul, when he's on trial for his life in Acts 26, actually walks us through those very same verses. And he says, my life before. He explains the fact that he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, that he was actually persecuting Christians and pursuing them. Then the second thing was he describes what happened on the Damascus Road, which we're all quite familiar with if we've grown up in the church and we're believers. And then he talks about what his life has been since that time, which also is the aspect of now this is why I'm on trial for my life, because I have professed that I believe in Jesus, that he is the Lord of my life, and that he is the Son of God. So you take all that and you look at it and you go, all right, these are three things. Now, one of the things that we're going to teach in the lab is this, the difference between a testimony and a gospel framework. This is a testimony. Testimony is giving God the glory for what he's done in my life. It's that simple. It can revolve around my coming to faith. It can also revolve around 1,000 other things. And so a gospel framework is actually presenting the gospel in a way that they can understand it and respond to it. So the first thing that I just did, my life before, what happened, my life after, is a model for a testimony, which could be about my salvation or my putting Jesus number one in my life, which is what you're about to now do. I've modeled it for you. And so what I want you to do right now is take just a couple of minutes. The first thing that I want you to do is write down 1 to 2 words that describe your life before Christ. It could be attitudes, actions, all the things that maybe are doing that, maybe a sense of peace or lack of peace, and to write down just 1 or 2 words. So you're going to do that first. Second thing that you're going to do is what happened. In 1 to 2 sentences, what happened at that moment that you either came to faith or that maybe you were baptized younger. That's why we didn't ask you earlier to pin down when were you baptized or to give an age. So I didn't give an age in what I was talking about. All I did was talk about, and I didn't say it was the Fellowship of Christian Athletes camp that was over in North Carolina. We tend to give way too many details. This is just brief to invite interest and then to follow through with that. So 1 to 2 sentences, make sure Jesus is part of it. Otherwise, it's self-help. You just decided to get better. You didn't just decide to get better. Jesus saved you and transformed you. So make sure he gets his credit in the middle. And then, why has that made a difference? Since that moment, you're not perfect, but what have you seen and others have seen as changes? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes. I want you to 1 to 2 words, life before, 1 to 2 sentences, what happened, 1 to 2 words to describe my life after coming to faith. And then what you're going to do, I think you've got the pattern now. You're going to go pair up with one other person. We'll have a timer on it because it took me a little less than 2 minutes to do it, to describe that life before, what happened, and life after. And then you're going to share that with the other person. Now, before you get there, we feel really awkward when somebody tells us a testimony. We're kind of like, because we're evaluating, did they say all the right words? Did they cover everything? You only have one appropriate response. That's amazing what God did in your life. So we're going to practice that together, okay? We're going to all say that together. That's amazing what God did in our life. And so that you can then give God the glory for what the other person shared. And then you swap. The other person shares their life before, what happened, and life after. Okay, and we'll pull it back together here in just a few minutes. All right, so how did that feel? I'm going to invite feedback from you guys. I know it's awkward. First time you do anything. We had a friend who said, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly the first time. So there you go. This is really worth doing. So I would encourage you to practice this week. It is very easy to practice this with another believer, and that's where I want you to start. In fact, it could be a family member, it could be somebody in your life group, but I really encourage you this next week to walk through what you've just done. Now, 2 warnings. Number 1, it's not a script. Don't write this out, memorize it, and then do it as a script, because it's not that. The second thing is, I didn't start with that young man, when I first met him. Hi, my name is David, and there was a time in my life when. It's in conversation. It's in listening. Remember the second piece we talked about praying? We've already prayed for people who don't know Jesus. Now we're listening. And I heard him say, I struggle with this. And I could say there was a time in my life when. Now, I could have entered with lots of different things depending on the circumstances, the situation, is because there's thousands of things that God has transformed in me. And so my beginning point could look different. What happened doesn't change, and the behaviors afterwards would be customized to whatever it is that we were talking about. So I challenge you to practice it this week. And now we're going to look at the next section.